Okay, so welcome to session 2 of our study of the letter to the Galatian community by the Apostle Paul. Today we're going to begin to identify the players. That's what it says there on in your notes, because identifying the who in this sequence of who, what, when, where, and why is probably the most critical of all. In it, we have to find out who Paul is, or who Paul thinks he is, and who the people to whom he is writing are, and we have to identify this third group of people whom Paul calls disturbers, if you will.
Troublemakers.
Troublemakers, it's disturbers, that's the way he refers to them. And so we're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about each of the three groups. And of course, it makes sense to start with the principal, meaning Paul the Apostle himself. So now, I would argue that at least in the religious theological world, except for Jesus himself, Yeshua himself, I don't think anybody, and maybe even that, nobody has been written about more than Rav Shaul, the Apostle Paul.
Trump would be a second for that, don't
I don't think so. He's got 2,000 years to catch up. There is so much written about Rav Shaul from so many different points of view that it is quite remarkable that anybody can make any sense out of him at all.
I know.
And we're going to make every effort to do that today. And I'm going to give you a little history lesson in terms of the development of thought on Paul, as well as exactly what the message is today that we're going to be looking at. Now, the scriptures we're going to be looking at are really in the first chapter of the letter to the Galatians. Hopefully you have read through the letter so that you're at least broadly familiar with what's going on. There's a lot of complicated stuff in there, I understand, so don't feel intimidated. We're gonna parse through this as much as we can, and we're going to, what I call close reading, really getting into the text and try and get into the background of the text and so on. So let's begin with verse 1. Good place to start anything, right?
Yep. Mm-hmm. So
it reads in the New American Standard version of this text, it reads, Paul, an emissary, sent not from men nor by man, but by Yeshua the Messiah and God the Father, who raised him from the dead. Now, I want to just rest on this one verse for a few minutes, because you know what I did? I said, methinks the lady doth protest too much. Why does Paul, do you think, have to say this business, Paul, an emissary, sent not from men or by man, but by Yeshua the Messiah and God the Father? What do you think that's about? Because you know what I did? I went and I looked at the opening line to every one of his letters. Every one. And I'll read a few of them to you so you can compare them with this one that I just read from Galatians chapter 1. So in Romans, Paul says, Paul, a bondservant of Messiah Yeshua, called as an apostle, set apart for the gospel of God. Okay? Because in the ancient days, of course, that's how people wrote letters. When they wrote an epistle, a letter, you always identified yourself first. And then you identified the people to whom you were writing, and then the body of the letter, and then whatever, greetings you may have wanted to do at the end of the letter. That's the way letters, most letters in the Roman world were written. Okay? In our day, we identify the person to whom we're writing. We don't identify ourselves until the very end. Right? Different form. But here, Paul says in Romans, I'm a bondservant of Messiah Yeshua, called an apostle, set apart for the gospel. Okay? 1 Corinthians, he says, Paul, called as an apostle of Messiah Yeshua by the will of God. In 2 Corinthians, Paul, an apostle of Messiah Yeshua by the will of God. Okay, let's skip to Ephesians. Paul, an apostle of Messiah Yeshua by the will of God. And then Philippians, Paul and Timothy, bondservants of Messiah Yeshua. Colossians, Paul, an apostle of Messiah Yeshua by the will of God. Now, what's the difference between those 4, 5, or 6 that I just read to you and the one that I read from Galatians?
You mentioned bondservant.
No, he's a bondservant all the time.
But what
In Galatians,
He
what's the
was-
difference?
He's mentioning the resurrection. He's
No.
being more specific about it.
What is he being more specific about?
Who sent
That
him?
God the
Not-
Father
not-
sent him.
Not from man.
Yes.
from man, right.
Notice how.
No,
Why is he
by
mentioning men? He never mentions men before. He's always talking
Yeah.
about God and Yeshua, right?
Yep.
Why does he feel in this particular letter the need to mention that he's not an emissary from some man?
Well, maybe because the Galatians were thinking of him like that.
Because prior to his conversion, if you will, or experience, he was known for persecuting all of the believers.
Yeah.
This kind of says, hey, now I am one.
All right.
I'm not what I used to
A
be.
little background is necessary. Paul knew the Galatian people very well.
Yeah.
This letter comes years after he originally went and visited with them and spent time there. He talks about this later on in this particular letter, actually, that he first visited them and he had an illness. And they took him in and he spent a lot of time with them, whoever these folks are. So they were well acquainted with Paul. They were well acquainted with his teachings. So we're not talking about strangers here. So again, I ask the question, what is it that's making him be so adamant about where his authority comes from?
I think he wanted to establish his authority.
Correct, that is correct. He wants to. But one would have thought that authority had already been established.
Well, if it was years in between, maybe they forgot exactly where he was coming from and what authority he had.
He was really first time Galatians people by believing, and they received, they baptized by Holy Spirit, or they have salvation. But later on, they go back to the law.
Okay, so let's
So
see.
they have to do the circumcise,
Uh-huh.
and
Okay, so
so
let's.
that's
so
why
you-
he
now
was
you're
so-
attempting to identify an issue that is risen, that rises up in the stuff. So that's what we have. Part of what we have to clarify as what is the issue.
Yeah.
Okay. Right now we're trying to identify the people, so that we can identify later on how those issues apply to those people. So let's read a little bit more of the letter. Maybe this will clarify. Let's get beyond the first verse, right? So if you have a Bible, you can turn to Galatians chapter 1. And we're going to look at a few verses here. So again, it says, Paul, an apostle, not sent from men, nor through the agency of man, but through Messiah Yeshua and God the Father who raised him from the dead. And all the brethren who are with me. He wrote this letter, I don't exactly remember when he wrote this. This is one of his earlier letters. It says, to the churches of Galatia. Grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Messiah Yeshua, who gave himself for our sins so that he might rescue us from the present evil age, according to the will of our God and Father, to whom be the glory forevermore. Now, so that's the way people write letters in the ancient days. Identify themselves, identify the people to whom they're writing, and an opening, salvo. Grace to you and peace. That's generally Paul's format. but he jumps immediately into what's causing the shpilkus in him. He's aggravated. And by the way, when you read this letter, it's an aggravated letter. He's very aggravated. Now, you don't get angry and aggravated at somebody unless you know them really well. You know, who are you to yell and scream at me if you don't even know me, right? But this is a letter in which one of Paul's more agitated letters. And this is one of them. And it opens up with that immediately and in his effort to identify the problem. So he says, I'm amazed that you're so quickly deserting him who called you by the grace of Messiah for a different gospel. So by the way, we're going to have to figure out what this different gospel is. I mean, we first have to figure out what the gospel is before we, or at least according to Paul, and then we can talk about what this other gospel might be. So he says, they called you to a different gospel, which is really not another, only there are some who are disturbing you who want to distort the gospel of Messiah. So we're going to have, this is that other question. Who then are these people who are disturbing them and why?
Maybe Pharisees.
You can't answer the question yet. We can't answer the question. And we're going to have to get deeper, much deeper into this letter before we can answer that question. We only know that Paul doesn't like it. That's how much we can discern at the moment. Paul is very angry about it. And look what he says. I mean, this is mean. He says, but even if we or an angel from heaven should preach to you a gospel contrary to what we preach to you, he is to be accursed. And that's rough.
That's wrong. Yeah.
We're talking about something very rough, right? He says, and as we've said before, and I say to you again, if any man has preached you a gospel contrary to what you received, he is to be accursed. Now, you don't repeat something like that unless you're mad, unless you're pretty angry, right?
Yes.
So we have to,
Mine here, this
Yeah.
translation.
Yeah.
Okay. It says the evil world system. Does it say cursed?
I'm sorry, read it. Read the
From
verse.
the evil world system. The grace and shalom, well, I'll start with 3. The grace and shalom to you, the God the Father, and from the Lord Yeshua, the Messiah, who gave himself for our sins.
Oh, you're going all the way back to verse 3. I mean,
I'm sorry.
we're
And then it says, might deliver us from the present or evil world system.
yeah, well, that's fine.
That's kind of like where his anger starts, maybe.
No. He's
No?
not angry about that. He knows the world is rotten. I mean, that's not news. What is angering him is the way the Galatians have received this message. You see what, he says, I'm amazed that you're so quickly deserting him who called you by the grace of Messiah to a different gospel. That's what's making him angry. Okay, so now we might be able to understand a little bit about verse 1. He says there are these other people who are disturbing. Now, he hasn't gone beyond that to identify them, although we'll get more clues about who they are later. But he says, these people have come and disturbed you. Don't you remember? Don't you know who I am? I am the apostle sent to you by God himself. I wasn't sent here by a man. So I don't know who these guys are who are coming to you, but God did not send them. God sent me. How are you listening to them? You see? So there's a question of authority. So we need to, let's discuss Paul a little bit. Now, listen, particularly in the earlier days of his ministry, Paul did not have a great reputation among the believers. A lot of believers were angry with him and upset. I want you to think about this, like if it was you. All right? So let's say you're one of the early believers. Let's talk about the community, particularly in Jerusalem in that area. Okay? And Stephen maybe was a friend of yours. Remember that guy, Stephen? Now we're told in the book of Acts that there was a young man who was there holding the coats of the people who stoned Stephen. Later on, this same young man becomes a persecutor of the believers. And from what we understand about his persecution, he had legal papers from authorities to ruin your life. Ruin it. You know, just go in and confiscate your property, all kinds of things, which I think he probably did. You know, so he wasn't. So now all of a sudden he becomes a believer. Does that change your mind about him necessarily? Yeah, you know, you hope in your heart of hearts, and you know, the magnanimity of Messiah just overwhelms you, and you're glorying God. But if Stephen was a friend of yours, or maybe it was your cousin or brother or mother
That's the
who was
refreshing your
displaced
mind.
by this guy, how do you think you feel about him?
You don't trust him. Don't believe him.
It would be hard.
Yes, it would.
Okay. So that, you know, there's that one issue where Paul is not really one of the guys.
Yeah.
And I would argue for a long time he did not maybe ever become one of the guys. He had his own guys. But he's never part of that, you know, real Yaakov and Peter and the in group in Jerusalem. We leave that door open for a few minutes and let the air get in here. I'd like to check the air conditioning and see if it's wrong. Anyway,
Want me to go do that?
the air. Well, do you know how to use this?
No, but I know where Tom is.
Okay. Tom knows.
Good enough.
Know what to do. So, anyway, I'm trying to set up a scenario here where Paul spends some time in justifying his claims to his apostleship. And that's what I want us to focus on. Because right off the bat, he's having trouble with just the fact that they've responded to these other people. And this is after years, you know, he was there. He taught them the gospel. He told them what it was really all about. You know, blah, blah, blah. And then these guys come in, and they're going to hand them a whole other story about the gospel, which we'll get into, you know, the what, after we've understood the who a little bit better. All right, so let's talk about Paul a little more in depth. So, you know, in verse 10 he says, For am I now seeking the favor of men or of God, or am I striving to please men? If I was still trying to please men, I would not be a bondservant of Messiah. So you see his argument continues that this is somehow they're hearing a man-made story, but his is a divine story, one that has been delivered to him by Yeshua. Okay? So, let's talk about, I want to talk about his Damascus Road experience. So let's turn to the book of Acts, chapter 9. Now, let me tell you, in the book of Acts, I think there are 3 accounts of this, what happens to him on the Damascus Road. And he is going to describe here in Galatians his experience there too. So we're going to compare these things. Let's go first to the book of Acts, chapter 9. This is a familiar story to most people. We're not going to cover all of it. I just want to do a few of the verses, right? So in verse 1, it says, Now Shaul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest. And he asked for letters from him to the synagogues at Damascus, so if he found any belonging to the way, both men and women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. You see what he's going to arrest these people and have them thrown in jail. Drag them from Damascus to Jerusalem, which in those days is far away. As he was traveling, it happened that he was approaching Damascus. And suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. And he fell to the ground, heard a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And he said, Who are you, Lord? And he said, I am Yeshua, whom you're persecuting. But get up and enter the city, and it will be told you what you must do. Okay? All right. It will be told you what you must do. So now, the Damascus Road experience, as far as the gospel as it has been preached for 2,000 years, is one of the pivotal moments in history of the church. Because understanding what happened to Paul at that moment is key to understanding all of his teaching, and by extension, the teaching of the church for 2,000 years. So I ask you, what happened to him? What happened? Anybody want to venture a comment here? Okay.
Miraculous encounter.
Anybody? Anybody else?
When Yeshua approached him,
versus
he got full revelation.
Let me back up a bit. What kind of a guy do you think Paul was? Forget about good or bad. I want you to ask. Tell me what do you think about Shaul?
Well, he was
He was
very
passionate.
What was he?
He was a
was
very
zealous.
learned person.
He was learned.
He was a Pharisee,
Devout.
wasn't he?
And zealous.
Zealous, yes.
Traditional.
Right. Okay. What'd you say?
Traditional.
Traditional. That's hard to say because tradition. What was that in the person?
But he was taught the law, and he was
He
taught.
let's say
He
he
was
was
a Pharisee.
halakhic or
Yeah,
whatever.
halakhic.
Okay, as they understood it at the time. No Talmud, and so he was a Pharisee according to his own confession,
Yes.
Exactly.
meaning that he was very meticulous about the Torah as they understood it at that time. But he was also a zealous character. Why do you think he was doing this stuff, persecuting these people? He thought, what is it? He
thought
must
he
have
was in
thought
the
there was
right.
something wrong
He thought
with
he
this
was
group.
right.
I don't think he was evil.
No.
Okay? He was not just a bad guy. Now, what he did was bad. But he did not do it because he thought he was doing evil.
No.
He thought he's doing a service to the Lord God.
Yeah.
These people were destroying the people of Israel with whatever it was that they were preaching, this false Messiah. For him, it might have been even idolatry, the whole notion of who Yeshua was. All of these things might have been going through his mind. Okay? So the question is, if that's who he was before, then what can we say about him after he has this encounter?
He's still zealous, but now he's zealous for the Lord.
Yeah.
Whoa. Perfect. I'm glad you said that. Who was he zealous for before?
God, government, Father.
Okay.
Father.
Oh, see,
The way he saw it.
see, this is
He
very interesting.
understood it.
Listen, I think he was zealous for God.
Yeah.
His zeal was for the honor of God. And so, and when it's over, his zeal is for the honor of God.
Yeah. Still.
God.
But now it's the right
What's
way.
the difference?
Well, right, wrong. That's a hard question too, darling. Right, wrong.
With the crucifixion, is there anything that says what Paul's status was
At that time?
during the crucifixion?
No, there is no record that I'm aware of that Paul was even aware of Yeshua prior to the resurrection. He did not, he's never mentioned in the Gospels. He never mentions it in one of his letters that he met Yeshua prior to this meeting here on the road to Damascus, that he ever knew who he was or ever saw him in the temple when he was teaching or any of those sort of things. We only know what happened after. Okay? So one must assume, what you can assume from all of that is that Paul, as a zealous Pharisee, opposed the messiahship of this person, Yeshua, who he figured was executed as a criminal and should receive no other consideration other than the fact that he was a criminal. He got executed. Goodbye. And that this group that had grown up around him were mistaken. But his zeal for God was always there. This is what motivated him to begin with. So now, one of the great things, one of the sort of hallmarks of the development of Paul's life is that this moment of his encounter with Yeshua is considered a conversion. Now, why is that important? Because well, you answer it first before I answer it, if you think why. Why is considering it a conversion? What is the meaning of that?
I don't think a change, like a complete turnaround.
Okay.
Used to be people God oriented. Now, after Jesus crucified, Paul became Jesus oriented. So the grace oriented.
Okay.
Paul is a law oriented.
Okay, so again, let me read some of Paul's openings. I'll read a few more. Paul, an apostle of Messiah Yeshua by the will of God. Paul, an apostle of Messiah Yeshua according to the commandment of God, our Savior. Paul, an apostle of Messiah Yeshua by the will of God. Paul, a bondservant of God and an apostle of Messiah Yeshua. Do you think that he had a hard time knowing who God was and the role of the Messiah in all of this? I don't think so. Now, I'm not getting into discussions about the Trinity right now. That's a discussion for another time. But I want you to understand Paul's view of this thing. That the Father is the ultimate in the and even at the end of our service, when we say the end of our service, I plugged in, when we say, that every knee shall bow and every tongue confess that Yeshua the Messiah is Lord, the glory of God the Father. We say that every time, right?
Yes.
He is the Messiah to the glory of God the Father. And then we say something else that Paul wrote. And I stuck this in on purpose, right? And it comes from Acts 15. I'm sorry, not Acts 15. 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Because it's a very important point about Paul's understanding of God and Messiah, which I think we need to recollect as believers. So it says in verse 15:28, this is what he says. Or maybe I should give you some context. Okay, for context, let's go back to verse 25. He's speaking about Yeshua and the fact that the Messiah has been raised from the dead. And he says, Yeshua, must reign until he has put all his enemies under his feet. The last enemy that will be abolished is death, where he has put all things in subjection under his feet. But when he says all things are put in subjection, it is evident that he is accepted who put all things in subjection to him. And then he says, but when all things are subjected to him, when all things have been subjected to Yeshua, then the Son himself also will be subjected to the one who subjected all things to him, so that God may be all in all. Mm-hmm. Okay? So we have to understand this relationship in the Godhead. Now again, I don't want to get into triunity, and that's deep in itself. But understand how Paul is viewing this. That Messiah Yeshua is exactly that. He's Mashiach. Mm-hmm. And he divine, yes. But there's a hierarchy within that, and he now has become a servant of Yeshua for the sake of God. Now, the problem with the idea of conversion is that the way it has been interpreted for thousands of years is that Paul changed religions. That Paul created a new religion out of an old one. He converted. This is the meaning of when somebody converts to Christianity, they were something else, and now they're. When you convert to Judaism, you were something else, and now you're a Jew, right? Mm-hmm. What something else did Paul become? Becomes the question. And the answer is, I'm sorry, did I hear a comment?
Yes, how you doing? I like to just a small comments about what I following up with what you said. What you think happened in the road when Yeshua appeared to him? Well, it said that I read the Bible in Spanish, so I'm looking at it in English. When he said that. Oh, give me 1 second here. When Paul encountered Yeshua, he said, "You are fighting," and in other words, he was fighting against authority. Why you persecute me? You're fighting against authority. That's the way I read it in Spanish. So I believe he understood that the concept that the Most High passed the authority to Yeshua. So it's kind of hard to explain for me because, like I said, I read the Bible in Spanish. But the verse, maybe Rabbi can help. It's like, so why you persecute me? Why you persecute me? It's you fighting authority, in other words. I don't know how the English read, but
yeah. Well, okay. So comment. Here's what we will discover. Paul, what we discover about Paul's understanding of what happened on the road. Well, he's going to explain it. I'm going to let Paul explain what he thought happened to him, rather than me try to explain it to you. I just want to get to this point about conversion versus something else. So conversion is this idea that you become something else, that you become different. I asked you to identify certain qualities of Paul before he became a believer in Yeshua. And you talked about his zeal, his intelligence, his observance. And we're going to discover whether any or all of these have changed in any way. The focus may change, but the man does not change. The man does not change. So here I'm going to just show you this book here. This is one of the most important books on the development of the understanding of Paul ever written. It's called Paul Among Jews and Gentiles by a man named Christopher Stendhal. Christopher Stendhal was a Lutheran priest and scholar, teacher.
Can you spell the last name of the author?
H-L.
D-A-H-L. All right. This book was written, well, this is a series of essays. And he wrote these essays back in the 60s, I think in the late 60s. One of the first essays in this particular collection is called Call Rather Than Conversion. And if I had had you all buy this book, I'd have had all of you read this essay, because it's one of the most important essays. He also wrote a second essay in this thing, which we'll get into at another time. It's called Paul and the Introspective Conscience of the West. It's a brilliant essay about what goes on in the human mind.
What was his first name?
You have it right on the bottom of our...
Yeah. Okay, so I have the quotation, I have it on the bottom of your sheet, because I quote from it here in your notes. All right, so
I was just thinking that, it's the same issue that we face today as believers. The world doesn't understand our faith. They want to see us as converting from one religion to another. And when you try to explain your faith, they still see it that way. They have a hard time, unless the Holy Spirit reveals it to them, what exactly occurred. But so that's the way the people then at that time seemed to be viewing it as well. Instead of understanding that God called Paul and turned his view, Paul still had a relationship with God, the same relationship he always had, but God was telling him something different, turning his direction into a different path.
Right.
And that's all it really was. It's a big thing, but that's really what it was. God's just turning Paul's eyes to look in a different way, give him a different understanding of things. But Paul himself is still the same person he always was.
Okay.
And in the world today, when we try to share our faith with them about Yeshua, they view it the same way. They're like, well, you're not Jewish anymore. Or what religion are you now? Or, this, or even if you're Gentile before.
One of the problems we suffer from is that, the idea of religion is a relatively modern idea. In Paul's time, nobody talked about religion wasn't viewed in the sense that we view it now, as the sort of very closed system of, with doctrines and, and blah, blah, blah. It was much more fluid. Also, the way we bifurcate civil life and religious life did not exist. It was complete integration of those concepts. You don't think about your political life apart from your religious life. There's no way to do it. Okay? And so there are all these things that divide us now, that compartmentalize us now, that didn't do it for them. Let me get Debbie over here.
Well, I think that when we're talking about who Paul was, that one of the things that we have to remember is that if he was, as he identifies himself, a devout Jew, it meant he was looking forward to the coming of the Messiah. Whatever he understood the Messiah to look like, that he was waiting for. And as you said earlier, he apparently did not have any contact or limited contact or not, famous contact with this man, Yeshua, who said he was the Messiah. And so all of a sudden, all these people are saying he was the Messiah. And Paul's like, well, if he's the Messiah, how come I didn't know about it? I'm a devout Jew. And how come those people who I'm surrounded with, the other Pharisees, didn't recognize him? And they all say he wasn't. And who am I to argue with them? So I think that we have to look at that then at this Damascus road, I think that's what God is saying. You're looking forward to the Messiah? Well, stop persecuting the Messiah, because the Messiah has come.
Right. So
that's the conversion. The conversion from looking forward to the Messiah to realizing that the Messiah is coming. Conversion's a difficult word.
Yeah, it's a difficult word, and we're gonna argue. And I'm gonna argue as Stendhal argued. He argues it in this way by looking at the words of Paul himself. So let's take a look at what Paul had to say. Back to the Galatian letter. And we're going to take a look at a few verses in the first chapter here that allows Paul to interpret the experience himself so that we can hear what he has to say. After all, what a man says about himself is better than what other people say about him. I mean, it might be more accurate, or at least from his point of view, right? Mm-hmm. All right. So let's read verse 11 and following. So it says here in those verses, it says, "For I would have you know, brethren, that the gospel which was preached by me is not according to man. For I neither received it from man, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Messiah Yeshua." Now here, this is very important. He wasn't taught this. He received it by revelation. What is that? Is that an echo of anything for you? Anybody? What happened at Sinai? It was a revelation. It wasn't taught. Okay, so now let me just say this. I need a copy of Perkei Avot right now, because when you read the lines of Perkei Avot, can you give me the is there an Art Scroll Siddur in there? Up on it's like there, right there. That's it. All right. In Perkei Avot, fortunately, in the complete Art Scroll in the afternoon, there's a copy. There's a copy of the Perkei Avot in here. If I can find it. Supposed to read Perkei Avot every Shabbos afternoon, by the way. I want to get really technical.
Where do you buy those books?
Online, man.
Yeah.
Online. Everything is online.
Amazon.
I have to look at the table of contents. because there's one line in the opening of Perkei Avos just that when I read this, it reminds me of that. Show us that to me. Where is it? No, man, Perkei Avos, 540 for that. All right. Okay. All right. Okay. So it says Moshe Kibel Torah Mi Sinai. All right. Kibel is the word. All right. So this word means he received the Torah. Now, however, when Moses, so then Moses says, let's see. So Sareh, that's the word. Sareh, the Yehoshua. He transmitted it. He received it, but he transmitted it to Joshua. Joshua gave it to the elders of the tribe, transmitted it to the tribe. In other words, Moses received it by revelation. All the others had to receive it from, get it from Moses, who had to teach it to them. Only Moses had the direct revelation. This is the idea of the two different words. So here in this thing, Paul is saying, nobody taught me this stuff. I didn't go somewhere and somebody tutored me about the gospel. Somehow, somewhere, which is not recorded anywhere in the book of Acts, for instance, or in any of his letters particularly, he and Yeshua, had a commiseration where Yeshua laid out for him what his mission. Now, let's continue back in Galatians chapter 1. He says, in verse 13, he says, "For you've heard of my former manner of life in Judaism, how I used to persecute the church of God beyond measure and tried to destroy it. And I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my contemporaries, among my countrymen, being more extremely zealous for my ancestral tradition." All right, so he's talking about his former life, the kind of person he was. He was zealous for God, zealous for the tradition, zealous for these things. He says, and I was in verse 15. He says, and this is the key verse in this segment. "But when God, who had set me apart even from my mother's womb and called me through his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son in me, so I might preach him among the Gentiles, I did not immediately consult with flesh and blood." Now, I'm going to tell you something. How many of you are versed in Hebrew scripture well enough to know what he's talking about right there? Anybody? Look at your notes. I helped you. Listen, I worked really hard on those notes. You need to look at them.
We need more.
Where do we get them?
I will make sure you're on the email list so you'll get them from now on. I made a bunch of copies, but I guess they're all distributed. Maybe somebody could share with you if they.
Sure.
All right. Look at the bottom of the page, of that first page 5. Page 5 right there. So here, I say Paul's interpretation of his encounter with Messiah Yeshua does not entail a conversion to another religion. Instead, he sees it as a prophetic call to a different mission than the one he had been up to that point. And this is a quotation from Paul among Jews and Gentiles, this essay that I was just referring to, and he says, thus in Galatians, Paul describes his experience in terms of a prophetic call similar to that of Isaiah and Jeremiah. He felt handpicked by God after the prophetic model to take the message of God and Messiah to the Gentiles. So let's take a look at this text. On page 6, These are echoes of Scripture. For instance, Isaiah 49, verse 1. The Lord called me from the womb, from the body of my mother, and named me. Right? Well, how does Paul say it? Paul says, but when God, who set me apart from birth, he set me apart from birth for this. Right? That's even before Yeshua's ministry. If our timing is correct. Right? And then he goes again in Jeremiah chapter 1:5. It says, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. And before you were born, I consecrated you. I have appointed you a prophet to the nations. That's Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 5. Okay? So, but however, Christian tradition has attempted to put Paul's experience outside of that. Paul himself speaks about it as a prophetic call. He doesn't say, I realized Judaism was screwed up. And everything I've known from that time on was false. Because if that's true, then the rest of his life is just a hypocritical lie anyway. Okay? But instead, he saw himself as a prophet in the Old Testament sense. And that he had a message that he had to deliver to the nations. You say in verse 16, his grace was pleased to reveal his son in me so I might preach him among the Gentiles. That was my job. So he feels, again, going back to this whole issue of identifying and clarifying for the Galatian people who he is and where his authority comes from. He is saying in no uncertain terms, I am the apostle from God to the nations. Whoever these other people are, they're not from that, and they should be accursed. So we need to understand Paul as an Old Testament prophet's context, particularly when it comes to his mission to the nations. Now, this becomes very important in our understanding of Pauline theology, because if he is the apostle to the nations, and later on in chapter 2, he's going to talk even more about how he had the mission to the nations, Peter had the mission to the Jews, that what he says about God, what he says about Torah, what he says about relationships, all of these things are because he is the apostle to the nations, not to the Jewish people. Now, he may have a word for his own people, but his specific calling is to reach out to the nations. So what I argue that what happened, let's take a look at another one. I just want I want the Bible to speak for us here. So we go back into the book of Acts and look at another episode, another description of what happened to Paul. Let's take a look in chapter 22. So let me set the scene for you here. In chapter 21, Paul had returned from his third missionary journey. This is probably about 30 years after he started. Okay, he's about 30 years into his life in Messiah. A long time. And he went back to Jerusalem after all these years. He hadn't been to Jerusalem for a while. And he goes there and meets with Yaakov, Yeshua's brother, who is the leader of the Messianic community in Jerusalem, and with others who are there, who are leaders. and he reports to them about all the work that's been going on in the nations, among the Gentiles. And they say, "Oh, that's all good, but Paul, we've heard that you're teaching Jews in the diaspora that they should not circumcise their children or follow the tradition. And now look at all the people, all of the believers who are here. They're all zealous for Torah, man. They're going to know that you've come here, man. So we need to do something publicly that would demonstrate that this is not true. Of course, Paul said, yeah, that's not true. In fact, in chapter 18, Paul had observed the Nazirite vow. I mean, he'd gone through the whole thing, you know. So here they have other men who are taking a Nazirite vow. And he says, listen, participate with them. Go with them to the temple, make the sacrifice, and yada, yada, yada. Everybody will know. Okay. Yeah, cool, no problem. So they do that. But now it's the next day, and they're doing it. Okay, and Paul's in the temple. He's in the temple area, you know, and a bunch of people will gather around. And it says, let's see, I want to pick it up.
22.
This is verse, yeah, it's chapter 22, verse, we're going to pick it up and say, let's see. We'll pick it up, we're going to pick it up right at the beginning, chapter 22. So he's there in a big crowd of people in one of the courtyards of the temple. And he says, and by the way, there's a big ruckus starting, so Paul turns to the Roman guard, and he says to them, listen, I'm going to speak to my people in Mishpucha and, you know, Hebrew, so like, don't get crazy. You know, I'm not plotting against you. I'm just speaking to my own people in their own language, right? So in verse 22, he says, brothers and brethren and fathers, hear my defense for which I now offer you. And they heard that he was addressing them in Hebrew, so they got quiet. He says, look, I'm a Jew born in Tarsus of Cilicia, brought up in this city, educated under Gamaliel, strictly according to the law of our fathers, being zealous for God, just as you are today. I persecuted this way to the death, binding and putting both men and women in prison. As also the high priest and the council of the elders can testify. From them I also received letters to brethren, started off for Damascus, in order to bring even those who were there in Jerusalem as prisoners to be punished. But it happened that I was on my way approaching Damascus about noontime, a very bright light suddenly flashed from heaven all around me. I fell to the ground, I heard a voice say to me, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And I answered, who are you, Lord? He said, I am Yeshua the Nazarene, whom you're persecuting. And those who were with me saw the light, to be sure, but didn't understand the voice of the one who was speaking to me. I said, what shall I do, Lord? The Lord said, get up and go to Damascus, and there you'll be told what has been appointed for you to do. Let's skip a little bit. He says, a certain Ananias, a man who was devout by the standards of the law. Notice, Ananias is also a devout Jew, a believer in Messiah Yeshua. So none of this, idea of changing religions is working. If you look at it logically. Has been well spoken of by all the Jews who lived there. Came to me and he said, Brother Saul, receive your sight. At that very moment I looked up and I saw him, and he says this, and he said, the God of our fathers appointed you to know his will and to see the righteous one and to hear an utterance from his mouth. But you will be witnesses of a witness for him to all men of what you have seen and heard. Now why do you delay? Get up, be baptized, and wash away your sins, calling on his name. Blah, blah. It happened that when I returned to Jerusalem, I was praying in the temple. I want to skip to where he gets into this. So he's telling them all about what happened with Stephen and the whole fear. And then he says in verse 20 and following, he says, and when the blood of your witness Stephen was being shed, I was also standing here proving and watching out for the coats of those who were slaying him. And then he said, Yeshua said to me, go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles. I want you to listen to the reaction here. It's very interesting. He said they listened to him up to this statement. And then they raised their voices and said, away with such a fellow from the earth, for he should not be allowed to live. Now, what caused that? What do you think caused that reaction in the people?
Jealousy. Why?
Jealousy?
No.
Jealousy. What were they jealous of?
Why should he go to the Gentiles? Why
isn't
he going?
I don't know if that jealousy is the right word, but you're right about that. Everything was fine up until then. The whole thing about Yeshua appearing to him was fine. The notion that God could raise the dead is not it is a belief. I mean that's not the biggest issue of the planet. But the notion that he would be sending him to the nations, that got their ire up.
What happened with Yeshua when he started speaking in synagogue? The same thing, no?
Well, the reason there was because they thought he was blaspheming. That because he's saying this about himself. I am the Messiah. When that got people up in arms. But here, Paul's not claiming to be the Messiah. He's just saying, listen, well, the Messiah sent me to the nations. And that got them all upset. Okay? Now, I'm doing all this to establish that Paul is the apostle to the nations. And that's how he saw. That's how he saw himself. Yeah.
The way I see this is what Paul was saying, what Paul was doing, was the next phase of Judaism. It wasn't a part, it was the next phase of Judaism. And by saying what he said, he was telling them they would have to change. This is going to all the nations, which you were supposed to do in the first place as a nation of priests, to all the nations.
Well,
so now you're going to have to change.
Okay, well, we're going
what's the one thing that man hates the most? Change.
Well, change, yes, but I want you to. I think we need to nuance this a little bit. And in other words, it's true that that God's covenant with Israel was evolving. Because it was coming to. Yeshua came to fulfill the promises of God first to Israel and then to the nation. Okay, but the notion that the nations could enter into covenant relationship with the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob on their own, as themselves, was completely a foreign idea. It was foreign even to the disciples. Remember what happened to Peter when he went to visit Cornelius. The reaction that Peter got. First of all, Peter didn't want to do it. That was one. And then even after he did it and he went back to tell the brethren about it, they reacted poorly until they got it. They all got it straight. So and we're going to discover at the Council of Jerusalem they were still arguing about it. And obviously, that's part of the argument right here in the letter to the Galatians.
I thought that when it went to the nations, it wasn't supposed to be apart from it. It was supposed to be in union with Judaism.
Well, in union, but the Jewish people would have thought, well, they have to become circumcised. They have to they have to be Torah observant. They have to do all
to change the requirement.
Well,
they didn't have.
But you're speaking 2,000 years after the fact. They're right in the middle of the muddle, okay? And they don't see that. And there is no New Testament to explain any of it, okay?
That's right.
You're only dealing with the Hebrew scriptures and what the Torah says, okay?
Back then, didn't that require a big change in their thinking?
And that's why they didn't do it, okay?
It shouldn't have required that big of thinking. Isaiah talks about it's too small a thing. That you are to be a light to the nations.
Well,
and it says that my salvation can spread to the ends of the earth. So
right.
This wasn't new to them. They may not
but let's understand the idea.
But
the idea of how the nations enter.
But the idea that
how the nations get it.
Yeah, it's the argument in chapter 15 exactly. What's necessary to be saved. They argues about the salvation of the Gentiles.
Yeah. Well,
it's also about exactly what Tony said. It says in several of the epistles of Paul that this mystery that the Gentiles were included. It was a mystery. This wasn't easy to see at that time.
Exactly right.
In the first, right there.
Right.
Not that it wasn't true, but this was the working it out.
It was a mystery. Something which was hidden, which is now being revealed.
Yeah.
Exactly. Nobody foresaw it this way. Right. That's not what they saw. What generally was, you can read this in many of the history books referring to Judaism by George Moore or Schurer or any of these guys who did these ancient histories where they analyzed Jewish thinking about these ideas or E.P. Sanders or any of these guys. You know, there's a bibliography at the back of your. Well, you haven't got the bibliography yet, but where they refer to, you know, Jewish thought, eschatological thought, that okay, the nations will be included, but only after they're, you know, included in Israel by becoming Jews, in effect.
Join the
Okay,
club.
and so that becomes the centerpiece of the argument here, because Paul sees the mission somewhat differently. This is what we're going to discover. But first, I want you to understand Paul and who Paul is. Paul is a Jew who is faithful to Judaism, but maybe what happens to him at Damascus is two things happen. One, he realizes that the Messiah has come because the Messiah appears to him. Oh, you really are the Messiah. Okay, I get it.
No.
And Paul realizes something about the time in which he lives. He is an eschatological Jew. In other words, he knows that there's this time. He knows Isaiah. And he knows that there's supposed to be, you know, the whole world is supposed to come under the, under the dominion of God. He knows that. And he knows all the nations. He knows these. Now he knows that it's now. That's what he knows. The time has arrived. And here is the Messiah telling me that I'm the guy who has to deliver the message. So nothing changed. For me, nothing changed for Paul, except the fact that the timing changed. And he got a clue about how the nations were to be included. I told you, the rabbis already had ideas about that. You know, you got to do, you know, if you're a righteous Gentile, you follow the Noahide commands, you got a shot. You convert to Judaism, you're in. All Israel has a place in the world.
Did the men have to get circumcised prior to Messiah?
Probably.
Yes, absolutely. If they
Therein
convert.
lies the problem.
Yeah, because most men didn't want to do that.
No, but there was a requirement before the Messiah, so they just carried it over to after the Messiah.
Well, why would you change it? When God says these covenants are eternal, I mean, does anybody have a problem with the English language and the word eternal? I mean, you know, God says these things are eternal.
That problem is the English language.
Okay, but let's understand, Paul gets an understanding of timing, that the time has arrived because the Messiah, the resurrection has begun. Messiah Yeshua is resurrected from the dead, and now the resurrection has begun. Now all that stuff in Isaiah kicks in. Mm-hmm. All that stuff in the latter chapters of Isaiah about the nations coming to Jerusalem and all the stuff in Zechariah and all is all coming. This is all happening, and he's the messenger. And so he has to get it out. The thing that he learns, and we will learn more about as we go along through this letter, is that Paul understands how the Gentiles are to be included. And it is not by conversion to Judaism. Okay? But that's something he believes. And remember what did he say? How did he say he got this thing? He says, I got it by a revelation. Nobody taught me. Mm-hmm. Now listen. Think about the other apostles. Think about all the other guys and how they understood their faith. How did they know? They knew because Yeshua taught them. Mm-hmm. And they were all together when he taught them. Remember the 40 days after the resurrection, he spent 40 days laying it all out for them. And then they received the Holy Spirit so that they can consolidate their understanding. They all experienced that together. And now you got this dude showing up who says, I don't consult with anybody. I don't have to consult with you. I don't have to tell you, this or that or the other. Can you understand why there might be some disagreement about that? And why Paul is so self-conscious about declaring his credentials? He has to establish those things in order that people will listen to him. Because, look, listen, if Peter or Yaakov says, no, not that, forget that. Well, that's going to undermine everything about what Paul is trying to teach them. And if they use the excuse, well, Yeshua taught us directly, and we don't know where he got this information from. All we got is his story. You see, you understand why there's conflict and confusion. Okay? So, getting back to Paul, let's get back into the situation. So if you notice on page 6, it says Christian tradition and later Jewish understanding of this event attempts to place Paul's experience outside Jewish understanding of the ecstatic experience he had with Yeshua. Yet an examination of Jewish thought of the time about these experiences reveals that Paul's experience is indeed entirely within Jewish understanding of the ways in which God communicates to his people. There are many, many times when God appears to Old Testament prophets and others in an ecstatic way. Mm-hmm. Think about Ezekiel and that whole thing. Or think about what we learn today in today's Haftorah reading. What do you remember? Who remembers what today's Haftorah reading was? What was it? Come on, people. No, Haftorah.
Haftorah, I'm sorry.
What was the Haftorah? Come on! Elijah, right? Elijah goes in the cave and God appears to him and speaks to him in a still, small voice, right?
Yeah.
So this notion of ecstatic experience, Jews invented that. So the notion that Paul could have such an experience and that would be somehow outside of Jewish, thinking, it's an absurdity. Okay? So, and again, in his essay, The Question of Politics, Paul is a diaspora Jew under Roman rule. And I had to plug that in there. Neil Elliott examines Paul's experience in light of Jewish understanding and concludes that the vision is a thoroughly Jewish one. And that Paul's understanding of how to respond would have been a Jewish one as well. Not as an abandoning of his Judaism for the sake of a new religion, but a call to a new mission within the destiny God had for his people and for the world. So it says, so this is the quote from what's his face? Once, Mark, no, it's actually it's Neil Elliott, right? But that was the book I took as well. So once such a vision made clear to him that God had raised the martyr Jesus from the dead, and then a realization that would have been intelligible within the bounds of Jewish apocalyptic experience, because the Jewish people invented resurrection from the dead. Okay, invented. That's silly, but it's biblical. Okay, the consequences would have followed a thoroughly Jewish apocalyptic logic. The vision would have confirmed to Paul that what the apocalypses promised God would do someday, God had in fact begun to do when? Now. The consequence would have been an abrupt about-face from persecuting the assemblies, but this turn would have been motivated and remains completely explicable within categories supplied by Jewish apocalypse. In other words, that he saw this as the end times. Mm-hmm. Paul, everywhere you read in Paul believed that the coming of Yeshua was an imminent thing. Any moment now. There wasn't going to be this huge span of time between the resurrection of Yeshua and his second coming. He didn't foresee that. I'm sorry that it turned out differently, but then again, we all got a chance to be born, right? Mm-hmm. So let's see. Where are we? So we've established that Paul has a direct revelation of God from Yeshua. That he is an apostle specifically to the nations. And I could spend hours now going through different episodes in the apostolic writings to demonstrate how Paul and the other apostles were all faithful Jewish people. They continued in the temple. They followed the food laws. They followed the purity laws. All these other things. They did all of that stuff. Paul makes a confession at the end of the book of Acts in which he's speaking to the Jewish leadership of Rome. And in fact, I'm there, so I'll read it for you. It says, After 3 days, he was in Rome, and after 3 days, Paul called together those who were the leading men of the Jews. And when they came together, he began to say to them, Brethren, though I had done nothing against our people or the customs of our fathers, yet I was delivered as a prisoner from Jerusalem in the hands of the Romans. So this is now 35 years. He's in his last imprisonment in Rome. He's going to be executed by Nero in a few years. And he's telling the Jewish community, not believers in Yeshua, the Jewish community, who he is. And he's stating there that he was a faithful Jew. So this is his own declaration about his life. So we know this about it. No, that's the end of the book of
It's
Acts.
Acts. Okay,
Acts
thank you.
28. Okay, so now we know, hopefully we have a better idea of Paul at the moment. Okay, one last thing I want to cover today, which is all we have time for, is Paul's relationship to the other apostles. So let's go back into the book of Galatians, chapter 1 and following. All right. So let's pick it up in verse 17. Now, this is immediately after he receives the call, right? He realizes the call. He says, I did not, and this is 16 actually, he says, I did not immediately consult with flesh and blood, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me, but I went away to Arabia and returned once more to Damascus. Okay? So he didn't go up to Jerusalem right away. You know, maybe partially because he realized if he went up to Jerusalem, they'd probably kill him, you know. I mean, there's probably a whole lot of bad blood behind that, you know. So people had to get to know that he had become a believer, or, you know, give him a little time or whatever his thinking was. Okay. So then he says in verse 18, he says, then 3 years later, I went up to Jerusalem to become acquainted with Kepha and stayed with him 15 days, but I did not see any of the other apostles except James or Jacob, the Lord's brother. So he only went up there to visit with them after he had established he probably wanted to establish some credential that he was indeed a believer and all of that. And then he could go and see Peter and Jacob and the others and at least become acquainted with them. So it says, I was still unknown by verse 22. It says, I was still unknown by sight to the churches of Judea, which were in Messiah, but only they kept hearing, he who once persecuted us is now preaching the faith, which he once tried to destroy, and they were glorifying God because of it. Okay? So now they're getting to know that this guy is actually a believer. So this is softening the relationship between Paul and the other believers, particularly the ones in Jerusalem. And then it says, then after an interview, this is chapter 2 now, then after an interview interval of 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas, taking along Titus also. And it was because of a revelation I went up, and I submitted to them a gospel, which I preach among the Gentiles, but I did so in private to those who were of reputation, for fear that I might be running or had run in vain. But not even Titus, who was with me, though he was a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised. Now, there's a dispute about this visit to Jerusalem. So let me give it to you. Some equate this visit with Acts 15. Now remember, in Acts 15, Paul and Barnabas went up to Jerusalem because there was an issue about Gentile inclusion in the faith. Some were saying that they had to be circumcised. Others were saying, well, Paul principally was saying they did not. Okay? So most scholars think that Galatians chapter 2, first few verses, and what's going on in Acts chapter 15 are the same meaning. There is a minority opinion that says they can't possibly be the same meaning. I'm torn. All right, I'm torn because the issue is the same in both of these things. The issue that's at stake, because you see that the whole thing about Titus, right? He says, I went up there to preach my gospel about the Gentiles, but Titus, who was with me, was not, even though he was Gentile, a Greek, he wasn't compelled to be circumcised. So it seems that the issue is that same issue about how Gentiles are included among the people of God. Do they have to become Jews in order to do that? Okay. Now, the problem is what happens after this in Antioch. And what happens with Peter after this? It's really hard for me to think that Peter, who stood up and defended Paul's position about Gentiles, then acts the way he does later on in Galatians. It's really hard for me. And there are a couple of other things that don't quite jive, tiny thing. There's no mention of Titus at all in the book of Acts. Yet he mentions it here. Was it a different visit or wasn't it? We don't know. I'm not sure it matters as far as the argument is concerned. It does matter as far as our view of Peter is concerned, though. Because if Peter, defended it and then acts like this, what a dirtbag. If Barnabas acts like that after, after
just reveal the human nature of those people.
Well, it'll be an interesting discussion next week when we get, to that. When we talk, because we'll be talking about the Antioch incident next in depth next week, because there's a lot to cover. Because it starts answering other questions. Okay, so let's use this last few minutes to talk a little bit about. We talked about Paul. Let's talk about these disturbers, who these people are. Let's assume, at least for the purposes of our argument today, that chapter 2, verses 1, 2, and 3, and Acts 15 are the same. It's the same thing. Okay, for today we can do it. We can get into that other argument another time. So let's go back to Acts 15 and try and and see what the argument is, right? So we go back to Acts 15. Right? And now remember something. Paul and Barnabas were stationed, if you will. They lived in Antioch. So Antioch is in Syria, and so some 100 miles north of Jerusalem, or so, something like that. Okay, Antioch in Roman Antioch was a Gentile city for the most part. There were some Jewish people there, but there were Jews everywhere. But Antioch was, by and large, a Gentile city, and one of the first cities in which the gospel spread effectively among the Gentile community. Okay, and there's a whole discussion that we can have about the meaning of that. Gentiles began to embrace the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and began to ignore their own gods, which was problematic. Okay, but let's read. So here's what happens. Some men came down from Judea. All right, you always go up to Judea, by the way. You always go up to Jerusalem, even though Antioch is north of Jerusalem. You always go up to Jerusalem and you go down from Jerusalem, just so you know. Okay, I know it's high up, but that's not the point. Okay, so some men came down from Judea and began teaching the brethren, unless you're circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved.
See.
And we have to, there's so many things for me to talk to you about the meaning of that word saved, by the way. And when Paul and Barnabas had great dissension and debate with them, the brethren determined that Paul and Barnabas and some others of them should go up to Jerusalem to the apostles and elders concerning this issue. Okay? So the problem is, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with all this, that there was the dispute about how Gentiles were to be included in the people of God. Rather than this use of the word saved, let me ask a question. Let me pose the question so you know where I'm coming from. What does it mean to be saved?
Saved.
Oh God,
What's
what's the typical definition of to be saved?
You're going to heaven.
Okay.
Are
What else?
saved from the judgment, from wrath of God.
Okay, saved
and
from
the
judgment.
sin.
Saved from our sins.
Saved from sin. Saved from sin.
From it.
Okay. All of these are typical definitions. I'm going to argue that none of them is accurate. They have yes.
When I think about save in that in that particular verse, I'm thinking about inclusion in the promise.
Inclusion in the promise. Very good. That's a good way to do it. Good way to say it. Okay. Remember something. Everybody, I want you, whenever we have these discussions, I want you to keep something broadly in mind. What I want you to keep broadly in mind is God's encounter with Abraham on the first time. In Genesis chapter 12. God said three things. Let's go over them real quick. I will make you great, father of many nations. I will make you a great family, a great nation from you. And through you, all the nations of the world will be blessed. So there are three promises in there. One to Abraham personally, one to the Jewish people, and another to the rest of the world. Okay? Salvation has to do with the resolution of these three promises of God. Forget about post-mortem bliss for a minute, people.
We don't want to.
Well, understand something. You're not going to heaven. No, heaven is the abode of God. It's some other dimension. We don't go there. In the end, heaven comes here, if anything.
Amen.
So let's forget that. We believe in resurrection. Resurrection from the dead and the renewal of God's creation in which we will live eternally. Okay? So that's, forget about heaven. So, so now, so
We're not going to be floating on it.
So, saved. This word that we translate "saved" is really a covenantal term, not a forensic term. It doesn't have to do with my innocence or guilt. It has to do with my inclusion or not or exclusion. And so, what's being said here is that in order for them to be included in the people of God, they have to become Jews. That's the issue. Yeah.
I think this may support what you're saying to some degree. The Greek here is sozo, which we
translate saved.
But also, according to the dictionary, can be translated rescue, deliver, keep safe, preserve, cure, or make well.
Okay, right.
The same picture we see in book of Exodus, when God saved Israel from the Egypt. It's the same thing. It's the gospel there.
Yeah, well, that is true.
So they're the same thing.
Yeah. And these people are included. And by the way, there was also a mixed multitude that got included.
Yes.
Okay, right? So, yeah.
So how come, but I don't think that's what Christians mean when they say saved.
No.
Because when they're witnessing to Jewish people, they'll say you have to be saved. Well, then, but we are Jews. So how can we be saved? Included, you know what I mean? They're using the term in a different way.
So that's why
that's how most people understand it.
So that's why you need to read, Paul and the introspective conscience of the rest. That's why I have to read that essay. Because ultimately, it started with Augustine, by the way. Yeah. He personalized everything introspectively. In other words, saved meant his personal salvation from the life he lived. Read Confessions if you want to know. Read Augustine's Confessions. That he was a libertine and a dirtbag and this and that. And he got saved from all of that, became this purified person. And he So he internalized, he made Paul into a man like himself. You know, that's the problem. He saw Paul's struggle as his struggle. Well, Paul didn't have any of those problems. Paul was not an introspective guy in that sense. He had a robust conscience, as the people call it. You know, he says, according to the law, I'm perfect. I don't accuse myself of anything. I mean, these are things that Paul said about himself. He did not think he had a whole lot of terrible personal sin. He had one. He persecuted the people of God. That was his sin. That's it. Pretty darn good. So we have to understand salvation. We're going to get into a whole big discussion because that comes up later in this letter about salvation. In fact, next week when Paul talks about to Peter and says, we're saved by the same grace, blah blah blah. We'll talk about it. But
Can you
anyway,
repeat the three things you said? I will make you great.
I will make it. So it was a personal promise for Abraham that he would make Abraham great and prosper him. He was. And he would make his family a great nation. And then thirdly, that through them, all the nations of the earth would be blessed. Those are the three promises, right? Okay. So the last couple of minutes that we have, back to Acts 15. So the problem here is this issue of having to convert. In other words, see, when I see the word circumcision, and you'll see it many, many times in the New Testament. Now, unless you're circumcised, well, women didn't have to get circumcised.
Yeah.
Were there no women? Were there no women involved in this salvation thing? Of course, there were many women involved. So circumcision becomes a euphemism, if you want to call it that. A euphemism. No, they were talking about getting cut. That's what the word brit means.
Yeah.
Brit means to cut.
But it
That's what it
referred
means.
to circumcision of the heart in the word.
Yeah.
What?
I said the word even referred, I think Yeshua referred to circumcision of the heart.
Yeah, but they were not talking about that. They were talking about cutting a piece of flesh off your body.
In the
According to the
context.
custom
We're talking
prescribed
about
by Moses.
context.
Right.
Okay. So
In Acts 15.
what's happening? So now, but there were women involved. So I'm trying to tell you, when you see the word circumcision, it's a euphemism for conversion. Because there were women involved and they didn't have to cut anything. Okay? So that's what we're talking about. You must become a Jew, become part of the tribe in every sense, and then you will be allowed to be part of the people of God, which is what salvation saved me.
But I thought circumcision meant the Jews, not the euphemism for the Jews. They're called the circumcision.
Well, that's another usage of the term.
Yeah.
It's another usage of the term, the so-called circumcision, which Paul says all the time. Okay. I think. No.
Who was the group that had to get circumcised so they could marry the Jewish women? And after they got circumcised, they all got murdered?
Oh, that was Joseph's. When
This
Joseph.
was
Oh no.
I think that was
That's
That
when
the
somebody
Midianites?
when
no.
I'm sorry. I didn't pick-
Diana,
I'm sorry, I didn't
Diana
pick-
got
I didn't pick it up.
Jacob told
Oh,
them
you're
to
you're talking about Dina.
Yeah,
Oh,
Dina.
who?
That was Dina.
Yeah.
Avenge the daughter.
Yeah.
That had nothing. No,
That was revenge.
that was just a revenge. That was a
Yeah,
ploy.
revenge.
The whole thing was a ploy to kill those guys. That's all that was.
Hey, by Tony,
Attention.
I- I think that in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 11, it confirms what you just said about the euphemism of the word, because if you let me read just the verse 11, it said, therefore keep in mind that once you Gentiles in the flesh were called in circumcision by those called circumcision, which is performed on flesh by hand. At the time you were separated from Messiah, etc., etc.
Etc. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So it's when you see the term, it's a euphemism for conversion to. And so that's what they're arguing about. And Paul, one of the things that Paul discovered, and we'll be having a broader discussion just as we get into Paul's theology in the letter of Galatians, is that Paul understood his calling as being called to the nations as the nations. He wasn't going to the nations to convert them. He was going to the nations to tell them that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was fulfilling the third promise. The third promise, that through Israel, all the nations of the earth would be blessed as the nations. Okay? And this becomes this huge argument at the beginning of the Yeshua movement. Because, as Ken indicated, this was a mystery. Nobody could figure it out from the scriptures, at least they didn't, that this was the way God was going to do it. They thought that there would be at the end of the age, this gigantic ingathering, all the nations, and everybody become Israel, one gigantic Israel. I'm guessing. And when it didn't happen that way, they were confused. I won't say confused. Confused is the wrong word. There were differing opinions regarding it. There was Paul, who had a revelation from Messiah Yeshua. This is what I want you to do. Paul and Barnabas and a few others. And you had this other faction, which we're now seeing, went to Galatia sometime after Paul was there, and began telling them, listen, whatever Paul told you is wrong. Now listen to us and do what we're telling you have to do.
Yeah.
And that's why Paul is so angry when he writes this letter to the Galatian people who he knew very well. Okay?
Yeah.
So next week, we'll pick it up right there. We're going to pick it up at chapter 2. You may want to refamiliarize yourself with this whole, what they call the Antioch incident, which runs from chapter 2. Chapter 2. Well, you know what? That runs from chapter 2, verse 11 through the end of the chapter. We have a couple other things we still need to cover about Paul's relationships to the other apostles. Just know this much, okay? Before we end, I see I'm just an important point here. He says after he met with, and by the way, another reason why I don't believe that, why I have a problem believing that chapter 2 of Galatians is the same as chapter 15 of Acts, is because there's no mention of the decision they made. Why wouldn't he reiterate that decision right here and end the argument? That would be pretty much the way to end it. What it does say is this. In verse 7, it says, on the contrary, seeing that I had been entrusted with the gospel to the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been to the circumcised, for he who effectually worked for Peter in his apostleship to the circumcised effectually worked for me, also for the Gentiles. And recognizing the grace that had been given to me, Yaakov and Kepha and John, who were reputed to be pillars, that's kind of nasty, gave me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship so that we might go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised. So there, they agreed to Paul's ministry. There was an agreement among the leadership that Paul had this ministry to the nations. So there seems to have been at least a tacit agreement. But here's what I think, is there was a tacit agreement on the part of the leadership. Didn't mean the rank and file fell in line. And there were plenty of others who might have said, listen, I disagree with you. And I don't think that you're right, and that's the way it is. And that happens all the time. That happens in every religious grouping ever in the history of the world. There are always those who, even if the leadership says this, look, Yaakov was the leader of the community in Israel, but he wasn't the Pope. And, so there were people who disagreed. Paul wasn't the Pope either. And so there was disagreement. It wasn't confusion. It was this idea that, hey, as far as my reading of the Torah says, it says this, that to be a part of the people of God, one must follow God's word. And there were others who say, well, God is doing something different for the nations. But the nations are not subject to Moses. And that's what I want you to, I'm going to leave you with one last thing. As we go through this letter, the covenant you must always keep in mind when you're listening to Paul's argument is not Sinai. Not Sinai, but Abraham.
Right.
Okay? So try to remember what the Abrahamic covenant is, and particularly how it applies to the nation. Okay. Next week we'll pick it up again and get more complicated. Right? I mean, are there any questions before I close? I mean, this can be confusing. All I wanted to establish today was who Paul is. Next week we're going to focus on Paul's gospel. That'll be the focus. Paul, what did Paul think the gospel was? All right?
Well, that's in 1 Corinthians.
Well, it's in 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Romans, Galatians, Philippians. I mean, you have to know all of that, right? Okay.
Can I have a suggestion? No, all of it. What we discussed, I think neither Messiah Yeshua, neither Paul's ministry, neither apostles didn't create any ideas, any new religion, or something new. The Messiah Yeshua and the Paul, they just reveal the way, which was in first century the Christianity was a sect under name is way to the relationship with God, proper relationship according to the Torah. And neither Messiah Yeshua, neither Paul didn't disturb Torah or change Torah or anything else in the Torah. So the way is always the same. Way to approach God, way to please God, and way to have a proper relationship with God. And they didn't change nothing. Neither Paul, neither Messiah Yeshua. And when they was blamed, it was false blame. It's false accusation, which is bringing to the Apostle Paul or the Messiah Yeshua. And they're all the same.
Okay.
False accusation.
Yeah.